Welcome back to my channel. I always wanted to say that, so I'm starting with that. This is the Formative Assessment podcast. This is the third one. This is on learning intentions, and my name's Anurag Jain. I'm a teacher in East London. That's my email contact, and what I'm doing is some CPD to help teachers improve their practice, and what I'm really using as the base for that is Shirley Clark's outstanding formative assessment culture and practice book. It's a really excellent book. Highly recommend it. I'm using that as the kind of baseline text for discussing formative assessment and implementing it in your classroom and in a school as a whole. Okay, so to start, let's start with 4 starters, not 1. You might want to pause here. I want you to read through these and evaluate these different starters, and which are the stronger starters, and which could be improved and how. So if I was doing this classroom, we'd spend some time on it, but as I'm the only one speaking here, I'm going to just walk you through it. Okay, so let's go to the first one. So the first one is students come in and copy out the title and learning intention. And, to push out the boat, maybe the teacher gets them to copy out the success criteria as well. Okay, well, the problem with that one is, the one you got to think about right away is, what is actually the point of copying out the learning intention? I'd go a little bit further and say, what's the point of actually titling your lessons, other than a kind of secretarial, once again, like a control mechanism to get students to actually be copying? What is the point of copying? Nothing my students like more than copying. I always and often joke. Instead, one way of immediately improving that starter might be a statement. Mr. Burling is the most central character in the play. Sorry, that shouldn't be a question mark. To what extent do you agree or disagree? Remember, the last podcast was all about talk. So what we're trying to do with a starter is get students to be thinking, talking, and showing us their understanding. It's better you don't have a question that's closed. It's better you don't have something to just copy out when they enter the room. It's better to have a culture where talking and thinking is what happens from the outset. Then you could get them on the next slide maybe to realize that the thing you're doing today is analyzing character, and they can underline that. It doesn't need to have a title separately. Okay, from a science lesson, there's a bunch of facts on the board. I'd like you to copy them out. In the course of this lesson, we're going to be using them. Okay? There's no learning intention. So how can we improve that? Well, the problem isn't, as I've already stated, that there's no learning intention. Learning intention could come somewhere else. But again, the problem is copying and just facts. Just facts that the student is supposed to receive in a certain way, as opposed to asking them questions. Here are 3 statements. You can see electricity. I'm not a scientist, I should hasten to add. Electricity flows through the wires. Electricity buzzes around us. Which of these is true? Which of them is false? The stretch, turn the false statements into true. Discuss with your partner. Why do some people believe these statements are true? We're trying to get students to think about the issues, to anticipate the learning, to immerse themselves in problems rather than mechanically taking down information. Here's another one from maths. The learning intention is to solve equations. There are 3 problems, and the students are writing the answers down in their books, and the teacher asks students to raise hands if they've completed. Okay, so the problem with that is, what kind of equations are they solving? There seem to be 2 algebraic ones and 1 geometric one, so it's a little bit confused as to what we're doing today. It's unclear, how does this starter actually link to the learning? If they can do this, haven't they already attained the learning intention of today? Maybe success criteria might help. I have a bigger problem, which is, how does the teacher actually know the students have done things correctly? If they're in their books, and let's say they're doing it silently as they come in, when they sit down and get their books, the worst thing a teacher can do is, everyone who gets it, put your thumbs up, and students learn to have their thumbs up and smile all the time, because they know that if they do that, the teacher will not call on them. Well, there are a lot of problems there. To get that one working, in addition to fixing the questions, you're going to really need to get a culture of talk, randomization. You might use whiteboards. I've never had much luck with them, but you might use a visualizer, which is, of course, well, for me, is a principal tool in the universe. And finally, here's this starter, which I think is the best one. It is justified to hit someone if they hit you first. Should bullies be treated differently to those who don't bully others? Evaluate these statements with their partners and do these 4 things. Define the terms, give an example, explain your example, give a counterexample. So firstly, these statements invite the students to actually take a position, to discuss, and what is being asked of them in evaluating. I'm presuming this is early on for these students, so they may not know what this term evaluate means, or they may need to have a prompt or a speaking frame. They're told exactly what to do. And what the teacher can do is investigate and find out what are the ideas that lurk inside of students' heads. So what I want you to think about is, how do we begin to develop a common language for what makes an effective start of the lesson? It can't be mandated, as with a checklist. It's not just something, because, checklists are great. I love Atal Gawande. I think it's an amazing idea. But for any complex task, it starts, particularly with teaching, checklists can become something very tricky. But without a checklist, we still need a common language, something that we can enter into critical dialogue with each other about what should go on at the beginning of a lesson. What is good practice and what isn't? Okay, now before that starter is to anticipate what we're going to be talking about with learning intentions. But before we do that, I want to quiz you a little bit on what we did last time. Okay, so here are 6 scenarios, and you're going to pause this video now to evaluate what's wrong with these 6 things, given our discussions on learning culture in the first podcast and talk in the next one. Okay, so you've paused and you've written down your answers. Here are mine. Here is how I would evaluate them. Okay, student is seated on their own. I often go into classrooms where students are on their own. And I would say that that is a major problem, because all students need to sit with a learning partner, or they will not get an opportunity to discuss the learning. Or worse, the discussion isn't part of that process. So if you are in a classroom and a student is seated on their own, there should be some attention drawn to that right away. The teacher asks a question and students put their hands up. Well, if students put their hands up to participate, how does the teacher know that all students have grasped the idea or concept? Also, how do we know that, how do we only allow those students who put up their hands to participate and dominate those high attaining, attention-seeking students, create shadows for all these other students to hide in and do very little? We should be developing a culture where there's no hands up and randomization, and every student could be called on at any moment. Okay, third problem. Student says, I don't know. Okay, so the first thing I would say, I'm imagining a young teacher being in discussion with me. What do I do? Okay, well, that's tricky. Right away, there's a really small phrase you could add to a phrase like I don't know or I can't, and that's yet. And that's just a really simple way to add a growth mindset to any moment. I don't know yet. I can't yet. So here's how I would diagnose the problem. If a student doesn't know or says they don't know, you could offer them more talking time to their partners. If it is a crucial question, in fact, that they need to know. You could, an alternative could be you could call another student randomly, then go back to the original person who said I don't know, and have them repeat, evaluate, think. If when you do that, other students find that they don't know, well, that's going to be an important moment for you as a teacher, because you're going to need to reflect and act. Oh, either I'm asking a question that's too difficult, or actually, I've done random sampling, and 3 or 4 students actually legitimately do not know what the answer is. I have to reteach something, or I have to adapt. But the more penetrating question I would ask of anyone, of any teacher, and this is the hardest one, is why is there a culture where I don't know is permissible in the classroom? It has to be one where you're pushing students to take guesses, to take risks, to get things wrong. I don't know is a refusal to try and to have failure. So the real issue there is a learning culture question. Teacher picks a stick and then asks a question. That's an often done mistake. All students need thinking and talking time. If the stick is picked first, all the students know who's going to be called on. They all relax. They know. The point of a question is to make all students think and to elicit evidence for the teacher to interpret. And remember that as the core reasoning or theory behind the practice. If you understand the theory, the practice will follow. If you think of it as a technique, there are all these little bumps you're going to hit. This is an advanced one. Teacher says, good answer. Okay, well, why? Why is the teacher evaluating? I'm falling into this habit a lot, actually, in this interest of getting pace and speed. You could redirect. You could invite another student to evaluate. The bigger question you could ask is, why do we seek teacher approval? The final one is something I see student teachers do a lot. Stop talking, get on with the work. Why don't we invert this into teacher needs to build talking time? And it's always learning, not work. Remember, the words we use really carry a lot of meaning. So I want to address some things that came up in the last podcast and the practice that we're looking for. Now that we have gone through these two podcasts, I hope I've convinced you that these are some of the elements we should see in any classroom. We should see collaborative learning culture, learning partners, talking frames, deep thinking, randomization, and sampling. Why? Because students believe they can grow. Deep thinking occurs through talking. When we listen, we learn what students do and don't understand and why. And it's important that the culture we establish in our classroom reflects our values. And collaboration leads to a high support, high challenge classroom. So what we're trying to do is we're developing our practice to develop a common language for what effective learning looks like. And when we consolidate this, and you'll have to forgive me if you're not a theoretical person or the theory in the last podcast was going on a lot. I've tried to reduce the theory in this one. This cuts to the quick now, what I'm going to say, because if you understand the theory, then where I arrive to should make perfect sense to you, which is to say these are the things we all should want to see in a classroom always. And if they're not there, it's not a failure. It's simply that is something to begin the critical dialogue. So if I'm looking at a class and I'm looking for metacognition, another notion I didn't really bring up but is quite popular and powerful is self-regulation, the ability to control oneself and to reflectively adapt oneself to different situations. These are the things I want to see when I see that lesson and when I see any lesson, including my own. And these are the things that should absolutely be present or that I should be able to discuss about their absence or areas for improvement. Similarly with talk, I should be able to see teachers and students speaking to one another, questions that engage all learners, all students involved in discussion and engagement, and teacher responsiveness, listening and adapting. What I'm going to be doing over the course of these podcasts is kind of delineate for you what we should be expecting from every lesson we teach, what we should be expecting when we see one another teach, and the language we can use to critique and discuss that. Okay, this is also a principle with learning intentions. Why learning intentions are important is students kind of need to know the big picture. Where are we going? So this is the book I'm interested in. This is the theory I'm interested in. But where I'm really wanting you to get to is I want everyone to have a familiarity with the theory and practice of formative assessment. I want you to look at Shirley Clarke's techniques. I want you to have an interest in her and the broader set of theorists that are involved. I want you to be more engaged and interested in research, theorists, and practitioners. And I really want teachers to feel that they can grow and embrace their professionalism, their professional capital, their identities as teachers. That's my goal. So those were the first two podcasts, Learning Culture and Talk. Today we're looking at learning intentions, starters, and success criteria. Next time we're going to look at more on success criteria and talk about the idea of excellence, questioning, feedback, plenaries. This is a map of where this project goes. Now I even have something in the future where I would like to talk more detail about the curriculum, and how to put together a curriculum, assessment literacy, how to observe lessons, reading culture, and leadership for learning. These are all things that I'm interested in. Why do I present this to you? Because you need to know where this whole thing is going, because that's going to help you understand there's a sense of progress. And that's what learning intentions are about. So what we're going to do today is we're working towards developing this common language of evaluating practice. And what we're going to look at specifically is learning intentions and success criteria. And what we've looked at so far is we've evaluated some starters, we've done some talk, and I've given you the big picture. Now let's go into some detail. Okay. So this is from David Ausubel. This is, I think Dylan Williams calls this maybe the most important statement in education. The most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Ascertain this and teach them accordingly. So this is a good phrase to think about why there's no such thing as a master teacher out of context. A teacher isn't just great in and of themselves. They have to be placed within a culture, a situation, the relationships they have in the classroom, and also they have to know what's in front of them. That's crucial. That is absolutely the base. Now, how do we find that out? We can't, hopefully we realize we have all this technology. We don't need to wait till the end of the lesson to find out, to look at their books, let's say. We don't need technology. We have voice, we have talking, we have all sorts of means of figuring out what they do and don't know. The starter's a really important place. This very traditional notion, this amazing thing that we've all done, it is really a powerful moment to really find out what they do and don't know. Now, we cannot have students copy. I mean, it's become the worst thing one of the worst. I mean, what did I read a book? What is her name? Her name escapes me. Kate Clancy. She hates formative assessment. She really takes a boot to it in her memoir of teaching in Oxford. And she just, if this is just mechanical copying down, it's meaningless. It's the worst thing that's ever happened. Again, that's come from a tick box. Every lesson needs to start with learning intention. Utterly meaningless. What the starters need to do is immerse the students in the learning. They need to capture the imagination. They need to get them discussing and thinking. And what they really should start doing for both the teacher and the student is clarify the notion of the intention of this lesson and how success will be measured. How success will both be measured for the teacher and the student. And really, this is such a commonplace concept that we all think we understand it. And it really isn't as easy as it sounds. It's really worth the work to understand how these things function, the mistakes that we make in them, and improving them. Because the better we get at this step, the better we're going to be at really clarifying what we're doing in the classroom. So these are from Shirley Clark, some examples of starters. Instead of getting them to copy something down, why not get them to think? So you can start from the end. 5's the answer. What might the question be? You can do a statement. It was a good idea to bomb Berlin in the war. Do you agree or disagree? What makes a good insulator? You have a range of answers: plastic, cotton, wool, tin, foil, paper. Justify your answer. Why will this car move easily down this ramp and not easily down this one? Forcing students to think, justify, compare. Here's another one. Which is the odd one out and why? Now for this one, I just want, when we get to diagnostic questioning, and for those of you available to that, students have these amazing digital feedback mechanisms. Their fingers. They can vote. They can give you immediate feedback, and a well-designed question yields data that the teacher can act on right away. And so what we do is we start designing lessons that can generate information for us that we can respond to and adapt ourselves. And it really isn't about getting the right answer. It isn't about evaluating correct or incorrect. It's about changing the teacher's standpoint into interpreting. What does the student actually understand? How do they justify, and what things confuse them? So what the starter offers us if we start thinking dialogically, if we start thinking formatively, reciprocally, is an opportunity to actually gauge and understand the students' understanding, and also capture them into the meaningfulness of the learning without just the mechanical copying out of an activity. So it is worth always thinking about some of the pitfalls with success criteria. If you make them mandatory, then this is what you're going to get. You copy out the learning intention, and that's utterly meaningless. What Shirley Clark's found is acronyms like WALT, WILF, TIB. It just further crowds out the ideas and encumbers the learning. So again, acronyms can really prevent you from actually engaging in the idea itself. To make effective use of starters, learning intentions, and success criteria, you really have to dedicate yourself to really understanding why we're doing it and how we can improve it. And look, it can be confusing. You may right now just want to shut off and just be like, I know this one, or God, here he goes. He's going on and on again about something that's really simple. Sometimes a really simple idea, it can feel really confusing when you're defamiliarized with it and it becomes complex again. So just stay with me. Just don't assume you know how to do this. Just for a moment, pretend you're coming at it again for the first time. Because I think that if it's better to start in a place like that and build up, rather than presuming you understand it and you just need to do a few tweaks. I think that for me, this is a particular concept that I have had to return to, over the years, probably hundreds of times. And not until I really started to design my own curriculum did I really start to get to it. The learning intentions, the rationale, are very easy to outline. What do I actually want my students to learn? How do I articulate that? How do I state that? What would be a good way of learning it? And what do I think a range of excellent finished products would look like? So excellence, showing them excellence. We're going to talk about that in the next podcast. The success criteria, the rationale for them is a little bit different. So the success criteria helps us articulate what the learning intention actually means. If it's a closed success criteria, it tells us the steps I need to do to be successful. If it's an open, and we'll get to open and close in a second, I know the elements or the ingredients I need. I know then with success criteria, I can better understand when I met them and been successful. I can be clear about where I need to improve, and I can start to discuss strategies for making those improvements. So you see, success criteria, why we have to do it in this way is success criteria then builds up into feedback being effective. And then, of course, I can reflect on what I've done. It's these last four that are really crucial for peer marking, self-assessment, and feedback. So how do I do learning intentions well? So I'm going to go through these 6 steps now. Let's start with skill, not context. Okay, so this is Shirley Clark's real addition to this concept. Intellectually, she's known for really adding this. So once the skill is in its clean form, she argues, you can really break down the task into mini skills and become more process rather than content based. If the context is included, she argues, it gets confused. So here the focus becomes a sandwich, not the skill of writing instructions. So look, we're learning to write instructions for making a jam sandwich. Remember to do this, this, and this. What the student's going to be able to know is, I know how to make a jam sandwich, but if you ask me to tell you the instruction criteria, I won't know them. Here's a way that she says when you take the context out, we're learning to write instructions, which is actually what you're doing. You have to list what you need, use bossy verbs. This is for primary school. Use numbers, bullet points are similar. But by the way, we could use it for year 11. Write instructions in order, include diagrams if important. So here now I can write instructions for a jam sandwich, putting up a tent, pretty much anything. If you keep the context in the learning intention, it doesn't show the transferableness of the skill. Okay, so here, let me show you some. Are we learning to write instructions on how to change a bike tire, or are we learning to write instructions? Are we learning to construct arguments for and against suicide, or are we learning to construct arguments for and against emotionally charged positions? Look really carefully. When you clarify what you're doing, the success criteria are much easier to lay out. Then you can add another column that delineates the context of learning. So here we have the confused one, clarified, and the context. Here we have the confused one, the clarified, and the context. Here are 3 more that you can look through at your leisure and puzzle through how you'd improve them. What's the problem? What is the benefit of taking the context out of the learning, detaching the context? Okay? So that's really the crucial idea. And once you get that, you'll really start to see the spine of your knowledge and skills accumulate in your curriculum, and the context being something parallel, maybe. Does this say what I really want them to learn? So here's an example again from Shirley Clark. I want today's learning intention, we're going to find out the temperature between our toes. Now, is that actually the focus, or is it to be able to use a thermometer? And then here are the ways I want you to use a thermometer, the success criteria. Notice that in the first learning intention, the focus rather confusedly is on the feet, whereas decontextualizing it, the focus is on the thermometer. So what I really want you to think about is the clearer the teacher becomes, the more clear the student will become, and the more clear success will be for the student. Number 3, success criteria structure. Once you get this clarity of what you're doing, so actually I'm kind of meta demonstrating this in my own lesson here. This is the lesson you're in right now. And what I've done is I have broken it down into those steps of success criteria. Your familiarity with those different steps shows that you've been successful. Once you've figured out what it is that you're actually doing and you've determined the different success criteria, what you've essentially done is already structured your lesson, because what you're saying is this is what you need to do to be successful. So your lesson should be built towards the success of all students. So once you've figured out what success criteria looks like, you have essentially structured your lesson. This for me was, even though Shirley Clark doesn't talk about this explicitly in this book, this for me was an enormous breakthrough in actually understanding how to structure my lessons and how to get rid of things that were not actually helping the learning or achieving. And that clarity will really benefit you in understanding this concept. So you use the success criteria to structure your lessons, and you bring it up in the lesson to remind students where they are on that journey. Okay, the next one, 4, knowledge and skills, different focus. So the thing is, a lot of lessons have knowledge learning intentions, but we get them to do something. So I want to know the key events of World War II, and what students are going to do is write a diary of an evacuee. And what happens is the success criteria kind of piles all of that together. And, we've already talked about taking out the context, but now maybe you might even start to think about separating the knowledge learning intention and the skill learning intention and how they're different. Do you want to know the names of the key parts of a plant? That is the knowledge. But I want you also to be able to label diagrams. I want you to know property of 3D shapes, but I want you to be able to use a Venn diagram. I want you to know what a volcano is, and I want you to be able to write an explanation text. These further divisions between knowledge and skill will further help clarify what it is that you want the students to know and how you're going to assess it. Might be another way of thinking about it. The things you're going to teach, things you're going to deliver, things they're going to practice, things you're going to model, things they're going to do with you. This is going to further clarify for you and them, and to really differentiate between the two. So the next one is something about the structure of observed learning outcomes, an idea that Biggs and Collis came up with in 1982. Sequencing is it is a very important idea. It's become very prominent in the UK because Ofsted has really taken off on Ofsted, this notion of sequencing. I think it's a very opaque and subjective idea that is being presented to us in a really concrete way, whereas I might offer you this idea that sequencing, it'd be great if I was being queried by someone who actually deeply understood my subject and was querying me on the sequencing of concepts and ideas. But I mean, I think that it's a rather, having gone through the Ofsted experience myself, I think I found it really quite shallow, and the understanding from their standpoint not as deep as they were presenting it. But I'd go further to say that maybe for me personally, progression is a much more helpful concept than sequencing. So if I ask you to just change your conception from sequencing to progression, how do skills, knowledge, and application progress over a term, a year, a key stage? And how do you and your teams kind of articulate that progression in knowledge? So Solo offers us a kind of really powerful model for doing this, and they have 5 levels: pre-structural, unistructural, multi-structural, relational, and extended abstract. And it looks like this. When you're pre-structural, you basically can't do anything. You're unable. You need help to even start. Unistructural, you kind of know one thing. Multistructural, you know 3 things. Relational, you can kind of start to make links. And extended abstract, you can go really beyond and start theorizing. Okay, so this is abstract until I start to give you some verbs that go along with this. So once you start getting these verbs, what you get is a really good way of progressing your learning intentions over the course of the term. You get this idea of what it means to progress in knowledge and skills over a unit, a year, a topic, or a key stage. And again, this is just one model to think about. Where are we going? So this will be really important when we start thinking about feedback, is what does expertise look like at the next key stage, and to have that vision of the entire arc of your subject, and to be able to say, okay, well, then the next stage is this, and then the next stage is this. To be able to have that in your mind and to be able to articulate that is really powerful and helpful. And this model really offers that opportunity. So here's an example from in New Zealand. Apparently they do this all the time. So this is a curriculum achievement objective. I mean, I'm not at all proposing or suggesting we rewrite all of our schemes of work to use this model. I'm not at all suggesting this is the only way to do it. I am simply suggesting this is one way to think about progression and what students should be able to do. So you'll notice the verb define, describe, sequence, classify, compare, explain, predict, generalize, create. There's a kind of progression through the ideas and concepts. Again, there are plenty of books to read and experiment with this. People have done a lot of work on integrating this into curriculum. I myself have thought about and experimented with this a lot, and it's very, very helpful way to think about what it is that any particular unit or key stage is doing. Okay, we're approaching the end now. So now that we actually think about, okay, what we're doing, we figured out what our intention is, we got to think about, okay, how are we going to know we're successful or not? Now, different lessons have different focus. Sometimes the success criteria can be located in the object, an essay, a solution, a project, the object that you're making, the performance. Sometimes it might be the process. And again, we come back to this knowledge versus skill issue. What are we doing in different lessons changes. So this is a slide I often use to differentiate this. So for a very basic essay, on the left, those are the elements that I would like to see in any given paragraph, with the opportunity of could. So that's a kind of stretch. So that doesn't have to be there, but it could be there. The process is, how am I going to do that? So for my students, often when I first encounter them, the actual act of producing an analytic essay, and again, thinking of that progression, comparative essay even more so. How do I even begin to do this activity? Okay, well, I'm going to have to sometimes take you down, and you have to do step 1, step 2, step 3. This process-based one is much more closed, because you have to do the things I'm telling you. Whereas the product one, particularly in the stretch and the advanced moves, is more open, insofar as you have to choose the strategies to use. So the thing is, the product self-success criteria is going to be really crucial when you're thinking about self-assessment, peer assessment, and your own feedback to students, because now that I've clarified to you exactly what I'm looking for, and I've taught exactly those skills and what they look like, giving you feedback on that is going to be a lot easier. So that's really an important idea. I should pause here and just think about, go back to this, look at me interleaving for all you Ofsted science nerds. Here I am bringing back Lev Vygotsky and his idea of the ZPD and being in that high challenge, high support range. Clark argues that in terms of differentiation, you should never differentiate the learning intention. For every single student in the room, they should be aiming to do the same thing. So she really has a great set of mockery for these lessons that are like some few, few, some, all, as if you're suggesting that there are, almost 3 lessons in one, and that some, in a way, you could start putting limits. You could be putting limits on students' progress and growth. All students need to be doing the same thing or aimed at the same thing. It's the amount of support they need that helps put them in the ZPD, the learning and engagement zone. It's the amount of support that helps them find their place. So for me, in my mixed ability classrooms, part of the success for all my students is to ensure that their learning partner also understands. And that is particularly for those students who are high attaining and who are making progress. Part of their responsibility is to ensure that the person they're sitting with is also making that progress. And that is explicitly something that's part of the culture that I try to inculcate in my classrooms, to make sure that everyone is being challenged all the time. Again, I think this idea is something worth thinking about. I think differentiation is still something that's really complicated, and what support means and what different support to different people is going to be a complicated idea. That's why, again, I have you think about talk. So here we have an example from Shirley Clark about closed and open success criteria. Closed is you are told exactly what to do. Open is you have choice. So you have choice of different methodologies. And then you have open success criteria, which focuses on problem-solving process and decision-making. So you see, again, we get a kind of scaffolding and a fading of that scaffolding, where all students are essentially aimed at doing the same thing, but it's the success criteria that are differentiated, not the learning intention. This is a good idea to think about in terms of topics and classes and cultures where, look, when I want to have a lid on my whole class and I want them to do exactly what I need them to do and they're not getting it, I close down everything and I close this and I say, okay, do this, and like that, I can seize back control and get back to where I need to be. The more comfortable the class is, the more abstract they're becoming, the more self-reliant and resilient and self-regulatory. Of course, then we open it up. And then, of course, with the visualizer, you can change the success criteria on the hoof, or you can co-construct it. And we'll talk about that in the next podcast. So, and in the next podcast, we're going to talk about success criteria and the problem with rubrics. We're going to talk about excellence, the co-construction of success, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we moderate doing that. So today, what we talked about is evaluating starters. What are good starters? What are bad starters? We reminded ourselves about talk and why the theory informs the practice. We looked at, and I'd invite you to go back to that slide about what are the things that we're looking for in a lesson. How can we define the things, the common language now that you and I should share when we're looking at a lesson together? And they're absolutely clear. Learning culture, talk. Now I'm going to add to it in the next podcast with learning intentions and success criteria. We talked about the rationale for these concepts, and we talked about doing them well, getting the context, decontextualizing it, making sure that the learning intention is actually what I want them to do, the structure of the lesson, knowledge and skills. I've invited you to think about and investigate the solo taxonomy and that idea of progression, and then, of course, closed and open success criteria, thinking about product and process. this is the map of where we were and where we're going. I'm open, once I'm done her book, I'm open to hearing what you might want to learn about. I'm very interested in those topics down there. And here's my plenary for you to think about. So how confident are you that you know and can articulate the progression of skills and knowledge in your subject? How do your students know the big picture of a unit? How much do you work on articulating the stages of success? Do you differentiate between knowledge and skills? Learning intention success criteria are deceptively simple ideas. What questions could we ask to ensure that we improve the way these are implemented around the school? So just having them present isn't enough, remember. So now, and this anticipates what we're going to do in the next video, now thinking about quality and thinking about this common language of criticality and feedback that we give to each other, how can we start to think about what makes a good learning intention and what makes an excellent learning intention? What makes a good success criteria and what makes a flawed one? And how can we give feedback to help sharpen up our practice to improve? So I hope that was helpful to you, and I look forward to hearing from you. I hope everyone's safe and well, and I hope these are inspiring your practice. I'll see you soon.